Hi, I'm Ed Fitzgerald from Quincy Historical Society, and today we'd like to take you for a look at an exhibit that Adams National Historical Park and we did to mark the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. We did the exhibit not in 2012 but in 2014 for a couple of reasons. One, of all the bicentennials and centennials that we have had in this country over the last few years and maybe last few decades, the War of 1812 seemed to be one that most people did not pay a great deal of attention to, and particularly here in Massachusetts. And I think there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that Massachusetts itself did not take a very active part in the war for the first 2 years. And second, a number of other activities had sort of taken over for us and really become the center of our attention. The Civil War, the Second World War, the two World Wars have really loomed much larger in our consciousness. But in 1814, a number of things happened that we thought it was important to try and commemorate. For one thing, the war came much closer to the Massachusetts shore itself, and for the first time, Massachusetts itself actually felt engaged in the war. And secondly, Quincy's native son, John Quincy Adams, was engaged for most of that 1814 year in negotiating the treaty that would finally end the war on Christmas Eve of 1814. So the exhibit tried to look at both of those aspects of what was going on in that particular year. It was curated by Kelly Cobble and Patty Smith from Adams National Historical Park, and we gave them some help, and then it was held here at the Adams Academy at the Quincy Historical Society headquarters, along with a very interesting series of programs and lectures. So lest we forget again about the War of 1812 for another 100 years, we thought we would try and record it and leave a little bit of to posterity by putting on tape some of the things that we were able to show during that time period. This is a letter from John Quincy Adams to his brother Thomas Boylston Adams well before the war, and it's from early in John Quincy Adams' rather extensive diplomatic career. It's 1798 when he's serving as ambassador in Berlin. And what's interesting about it is that he's talking to Thomas about Napoleon, and Napoleon at this point is in Egypt, and Adams is sort of warning Thomas that don't count Napoleon out, don't think it's going to be easy to get rid of him. And of course, Napoleon will wind up being a major factor in the next 15 years of Europe's life, but also America's life, and will be a factor throughout the War of 1812. This is the Josiah Quincy who will later in life be the president of Harvard College, the great mayor of Boston, the builder of Quincy Market. And this is a copy, a reproduction really, of the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of Josiah Quincy, and you can actually see Stuart's put Quincy Market in the background there. At the time we were interested in, the time of the War of 1812, Josiah Quincy is a Federalist congressman in the United States House of Representatives, and is sort of one of the most outspoken critics of President Madison's move towards war. The Federalists opposed the war for a number of reasons. They were, first of all, they didn't like Madison and the Republicans. They didn't like the opposite party. They were very distrustful of France, and they were suspicious that this was all being manipulated by Napoleon. And they were very pro-British, very much in favor of trade with Britain, didn't want their trade with Britain interrupted by warfare. Quincy made a number of very powerful speeches on the floor of the House opposing the war, and we have copies of them on display. One on loan from, it's a reproduction of pages of a document that's actually in the collection of the Thomas Crane Library of probably his most famous speech early in 1812 opposing the move towards the war. And then we also have from our own collection a printing of a speech he gave the year before, also opposing the moves towards war. Josiah Quincy was not an outlier in his opposition. Most of Massachusetts was opposed to the war, certainly during its first 2 years. And Governor Strong even refused to call out the state militia to be available for national service. John Quincy and Louisa are in St. Petersburg as he's our ambassador to Russia. In the spring of 1812, President Madison had finally decided that he had to declare war because the British were refusing to repeal their orders in council that interfered with American shipping on the high seas. And the war, at least officially, was being fought to defend the freedom of the seas and the freedom of American shipping. And because of the difficulties of communication, transatlantic, what nobody knew is that, in fact, Parliament had voted and the King had ordered the process to begin by which the orders in council would be repealed, so that the repeal was in process even as America was declaring war, but it became too late. The one aspect of the early part of the war that Massachusetts people were enthusiastic about was the performance of the Constitution. The Constitution had been commissioned by President Washington in 1797. It was actually launched under President Adams in 1798, and it had already been in the quasi-war with France under Adams, and it had been in the action against the Barbary Pirates under President Jefferson, and it saw action throughout the War of 1812, probably the most famous being its first encounter when, under the captainship of Isaac Hull, it set sail from Boston, captured 2 British merchantmen, and then fought a battle with the British frigate, the Guerrière, on August 19th, and essentially captured the Guerrière, did so much damage to the Guerrière that the Guerrière had to essentially be burned at sea. It was unsalvageable. And this was a huge upset victory. The British Navy was the pride of the world at this point, the most powerful navy in history, and that they were bested by an upstart American ship was really pretty embarrassing for them. They actually got to the point where they forbade their frigates from engaging with American frigates in one-on-one combat. They argued that we weren't really fighting fair because our frigates weren't really frigates, they were too big, and that it really wasn't fair for our frigates to go against their frigates. So the defeat of the Guerrière became really kind of legendary. Then in September of 1812, this now under the captaincy of William Bainbridge, the Constitution captured the British frigate, the Java. And then right at the end of the war, under Charles Stuart, it got caught in blockade a couple of times when it had to come into port in Boston and in Marblehead. It finally got out again in late 1813, and was out under Stuart, and again was able to capture the Scion and the Levant of the British ships. And then, by then it was December 1814, and they finally, I think, got word while at sea that the peace treaty had been signed, and decided to stop because it was peacetime. Apart from the Constitution, the American successes at sea were mostly in the early part of the war. Eventually, the British got better at fighting American ships, and the Constitution was really the only one that remained undefeated of the major ships, the major American frigates during the war. In fact, its sister ships, the Chesapeake and the President, both got captured at 2 different points during the war. Also, these were sort of like gunfighter things or knight in shining armor kind of battles. They really didn't have any major strategic impact other than the fact that it kind of hurt British self-esteem, basically. So even though it was supposed to be a war fought for freedom of the seas, the sea battles really didn't have much impact on what happened. We're into 1814, and what's happened is Napoleon's come a cropper in Russia by this time and had that terrible retreat. And the British have overcome him, and he's actually they've sent him to St. Helena, I think, by this time. And he's in his first exile. So basically the British are in a situation where they can put their full force up against the Americans. And so it's been sort of an indecisive war. Suddenly it gets very tough for the Americans. And they'd gone very light on New England up until that time because there was so much sympathy for England among the New Englanders. And the blockade during the first 2 years of the war had been very minimal. It was there to keep warships like the Constitution from getting out to sea, but it encouraged the traders to get out because there was still this very lucrative trade going on between American merchants and English merchants. But by 1814, they blockaded the full coast and began raiding the New England coast, and really that's the point at which Massachusetts begins to feel that it's actually engaged in the war. During the summer of 1814, they're able to take the eastern half of Maine and occupy it, and there's great fear that Boston will be under attack. Militia are mobilized to defend Boston, including militia from Quincy. There are raids on the coast. The Cape is particularly vulnerable, and this is a ransom note. Essentially, this was from the Orleans Historical Society, and they seized the salt works and held it for ransom. So it's a ransom note but demanding that the town pay $1,000 and they get their salt back, basically. It's extortion. James Lawrence was captain of the Chesapeake in 1813. Chesapeake is bested by, again, as I was saying, the Americans have a good deal of initial success, kind of take the English by surprise at sea, but then the English begin to overpower them. And the English are getting the best of the Chesapeake in that particular sea battle. Lawrence is fatally wounded and supposedly says, as his dying words, "Don't give up the ship, keep on fighting." But in fact, it's already too late and the Chesapeake is captured. But Oliver Hazard Perry is a good friend of Lawrence's, and when he hears about these supposed last words, he has them turned into a flag that would essentially look like that, the white lettering on the blue background, and he flies it from his flagship, the Niagara, on Lake Erie, and wins a decisive battle against the British on Lake Erie in September of 1813, and really keeps Lake Erie within United States control for the rest of the war. There's a lot of back and forth over the Great Lakes, but it's a major step in holding on to at least part of the Old Northwest. So that becomes the more famous rallying cry. That kind of takes over. I think that becomes sort of the one that people even begin to use during the war itself. Again, it's a kind of an after-the-fact recreation of the signing of the peace treaty, with John Quincy Adams there in the center, the British representative holding the actual copy of the treaty. Albert Gallatin is at Adams' left shoulder. Negotiations took place in Ghent. They took place over months. Couple of things that stand out about the treaty negotiations are, first of all, that it's one place where the Americans clearly outclassed the British. We really sent our A-team to this negotiation. The British were distracted because they were also having a Congress in Vienna to try and settle what they thought was going to be post-Napoleonic Europe, although Napoleon had one more shot left in him. So we had Adams and Albert Gallatin and James Baird in our team, and they had really kind of sent their AAA team to the negotiations. The other thing is the British overplayed their hand, much like the Americans overplayed their hand at the beginning of the war. This time the British thought they would do well in America and would be able to sort of force terms upon the United States. They got a couple of surprises, particularly in September, because their assault on Baltimore failed, the Star-Spangled Banner assault where they attempted to take Baltimore, but Fort McHenry held, the city of Baltimore held. And just a few days earlier, their attempt to come down into New York via Lake Champlain totally failed at the Battle of Plattsburgh. They were totally defeated at the Battle of Plattsburgh. So their negotiating position was not what they thought it was going to be. And then basically, the treaty established status quo ante bellum. Things went back to exactly the way they were before the war began. None of the issues on which the war was supposedly fought were actually decided by the treaty. It just sort of settled things down. So the issue of freedom of the seas was no longer a real issue. The Northwest border was going to be what it was going to be. There was no, and any issues were going to be settled later. So it didn't really settle anything in specific, but in the process, it just kind of meant that America had more or less held its own. And this one is actually an illustration from a popular history of the war published in the 1860s. So it shows that people were really interested in this. It wasn't always that forgotten a war. And again, just kind of trying to show kind of an somewhat allegorical and somewhat highlight overview. So you've got an American eagle and the British lion and the flags, and I assume that's the Constitution and the Guerriere. That middle frieze is, I think, supposed to be the fighting on the frontier that involved Native Americans. Then you got the peace treaty down at the bottom and one of the land battles. But it's just kind of, it's a more, not quite contemporaneous, but picture of the coastline, Boston Harbor coastline from around the same time. So, the War of 1812 has been called America's Forgotten War by one of its most prominent historians. The great American historian Gordon Wood has called it the strangest war in American history. But it's also been confirmed by Wood and by many other historians as the war that established American independence as a permanent feature and established the United States as a permanent part of the world scene. And we've tried to show in this program a little bit of how that treaty that John Quincy Adams negotiated went a long way, even though it resolved very few of the issues, towards establishing the United States as a presence among the community of nations. Thank you for watching, and please join us at the Historical Society and at Adams National Historical Park as we move on into the next year. Thank you very much.